Pawn to c4. Pawn to e5. Knight to c3. Bishop to b4. A Sicilian Rossolimo with inverted colors. Licious calls it King's English variation. Kramnik-Shirov counterattack. Knight to f3. Bishop to c3. Pawn to c3, taking back and opening the dark dragon. Pawn to d6. Pawn to e4, increasing the central control. Knight to d7. Bishop to d3, and we reach a brand new position. There are no games in Licious Masters database from here. Knight to c5. Bishop to c2. Knight to f6. Everything revolves around the e4 pawn. Queen to e2. Pawn to a5. White to play, what to move? If pawn to b4. Knight to c5 with equality. Knight to d2 was played in the game. Pawn to g6, an interesting move. A strange move. It looks like black is trying to fianchetto an invisible bishop. I think this is a psychological move. It provokes white to attack on the dark squares. Knight to f1. The horse opens a line for the dark square's dragon and uses the back rank as a trampoline to bounce back to a better square. Bishop to e6. Bishop to g5. White tries to exploit the weakness created by the g6 move. The only immediate ways of breaking the pin are with h6 gram5 or by bringing the knight back to d7. Pawn to h6. Bishop to h4. Pawn to g5. Black is playing consistently with his initial strategy. After exchanging his bishop early on move 3, he placed his pawns on dark squares to neutralize white's dark squared bishop. Bishop to g3. White's bishop is clashing with black's pawns. The only way of bringing it back to the game is by opening a back door with f3. Queen to d7. Pawn to f3. Knight to h5. The horse wants the fresh pasture available on the Kasparov square f4. Knight to e3. Knight to f4. Queen to d2. Pawn to b5, in order to increase the scope of the light square's dragon. Knight to d5. Bishop to d5, a great move. Pawn to d5. White has the bishop pair, but the position is still closed. Stockfish gives an evaluation of 0.3. Knight to h5, a dubious move. Where is the knight going after the bishop retreats to f2? Bishop to f2. Black to play. What to move? If king to e7 is the move preferred by Stockfish, connecting the rooks and protecting d6. And white has the advantage. King to f8, a dubious move, was played in the game. Pawn to g3, removing the f4 square from the knight and preparing to break with f4. King to g7. Bishop to e3. Queen to e7. Rook to g1, X-raying black's king. Knight to f6. White to play, what to move? If pawn to h4 is more consistent with the previous rook g4 move. Pawn to b4 white is winning. Pawn to b4 a dubious move. Was played in the game. Opening lines on the wrong side of the board. The idea is to take the horse out of play before opening the king side. However, now white's king is stuck in the center. Pawn to b4. Pawn to b4. Knight to a4. Bishop to d3, undermining the support of the a4 knight. Pawn to c6 a brilliant move. Sacrificing a pawn to open the center and create threats against white's king. Perhaps this was the move the goat didn't evaluate correctly when he played b4. Pawn to c6. Pawn to d5. Pawn to d5. Knight to d5. White has a passed pawn. The bishop pair. And black has a knight on the rim supported by an attacked pawn. So white must be winning, right? Stockfish doesn't think so. It evaluates the position as a 0.0. Pawn to a3. Rook to d8. X-raying white's queen. Black doesn't have time to defend b5. His goal is to maximize the activity of his pieces. Rook to c1. Rook to d6. White to play, what to move? If king to f2. Pawn to f3 with equality. Bishop to b5 a dubious move. Was played in the game. The bishop is hungry and gobbles a pawn. Black to play. Pause the video and find the best move. Yes, probably most of you got it. The idea is to use the X-rays on the d-file. Knight to c3 a great move. Attacking the queen and bishop and severing the connection between the rook and the passed c-pawn. Bishop to c5. The best defense is the attack. That is the motto. White has to give up the two bishops for the rook. Knight to b5. Bishop to d6. Knight to d6. Black has almost saved the game. The only remaining problem is how to block the dangerous pawns on the king side. King to f2. Knight to b6. Queen to d3. Queen to e6. White to play, what to move? If rook to e1, putting the last piece into play. Connecting the horses and severing the connection between the rook and the c-pawn. Rook to c4 with equality. Rook to c5 a dubious move. Was played in the game. The rook landed on a forkable square. Pawn to e4 a great move. Queen to d4. King to g8. White to play, what to move? If rook to e1, pinning the e-pawn. Pawn to e3 with equality. With counterattack. Rook to d1 a dubious move. Was played in the game. Pawn to f3. Threatening checkmate. White to play, what to move? If rook to c2, was a sturdy defense. White can't take neither the knight nor the rook due to the fabled position of his king. Queen to d3 with counterattack. Rook to e5, a blunder was played in the game. White is in time trouble. The goat finally collapses. Queen to h3, a great move. King to f3, a dubious move. Knight to c4, connecting the knights and attacking White's rook and pawn. Rook to a5. Knight to a5. Pawn to a5. The idea is to use the pawns to block the action of the rook on the f-file. Black is a piece up and has more time on the clock. Queen to f5, centralizing the queen with tempo. King to g2. Queen to c2. King to g1. Knight to f5. Queen to d7. Knight to e3, threatening checkmate. Rook to d2. Queen to c1. King to f2. Knight to g4, clickbaiting White's queen to distract her from the protection of d2. King to e2. Knight to e5. Queen to e7. Knight to c6. Look at a8. The rook hasn't moved the whole game. Is Gukesh giving rook odds to Carlsen? Queen to e4. Rook to a5. And White resigns. Ladies and gentlemen, the world champion defeated the GOAT. A double-edged game with an unusual structure. Black started a psychological struggle when deliberately weakened his kingside with g6 and provoked White's bishop to embark on a dark squares adventure. Black ended up with 2 knights versus 2 bishops. But the position was still closed. At some point White started to take advantage on Black's weaknesses and was objectively winning. But one misevaluation caused him to open lines on the wrong side of the board, and got his king stuck in the center. Black quickly opened the center and created a mess, evaporating White's advantage. The second last mistake of White was to grab a pawn, missing a tactic that allowed Black to get back material. White still had a sturdy defense, but after a blunder during the time trouble ended up collapsing.